Long Voyage Back, page 240. According to Neil's moon sunshots, Vagabond was now about 50 miles north of the reef and cays off the north-east coast of the Great Abaco Island. Sailing at about 7 knots, Vagabond might come within sight of land a little before sunset. The thought gave Neil little satisfaction. He found himself approaching this landfall warily. He and Frank had already argued that morning about whether it was absolutely necessary to take on additional food and water before sailing on for Puerto Rico. Frank was concerned about cutting their rations in half for up to 2 weeks, while Neil felt that starvation was not their primary danger. The Bahamian government had announced that it was impounding any foreign vessel that landed in Bahamian waters without first clearing customs at Freeport or Nassau. All weapons on any ship were being confiscated. The rash of piracies that were infesting the Bahamian waters could be stopped only by the rigid enforcement of these rules. All food was strictly rationed by the authorities. Foreigners unable to pay with gold, silver or barter for their food were being forced to join labour gangs or, those who had them, give up their boats as exchange. Though indirection had not made a landfall on Great Abaco Island their most logical choice, Neil would have preferred to stay out at sea, away from the dangers he foresaw in closing with the land. The sun was shining brightly, the sky a deep blue, and the sea sparkled with small whitecaps from the 12-knot breeze still blowing out of the east-southeast. Frank, at the helm, was pinching Vagabond a bit east of south, because when they came to the reef they would have to proceed southeast along inside it until it was decided if, where and when to take Vagabond into land. It was a little before the changing of the watch at 2 o'clock that Jean spotted a ship with binoculars. At first this was all she could be sure of. 10 minutes later she and Neil, trailing off the large pair of binoculars, had determined that it was a sailboat heading north, but without any sails up. A minute later, when the sailboat altered its course to the west, Neil thought that it, like the only other sailing vessel they had seen on their trip south, was starting to flee from them. Then he realised differently. "What is it?" asked Jean. "It's a drifting sailboat," he replied, handing back the glasses. "Probably abandoned, a derelict." She began studying the mysterious ship. Neil walked out into the port cockpit where Frank and Tony were looking through smaller glasses. "Alter course," Neil said to Tony at the helm. "We're going to take a look." "Alter course? What the hell for?" Tony asked. "There may be survivors," Neil replied. "If not, there may be supplies we can salvage." "Anyone still alive on that boat we can do without," Tony commented. "This close to land, the ship's probably been sacked already." "We're going over," Neil said. Within half an hour Vagabond had come to within 100 yards of the derelict. The ship's white paint was blistered and peeling. Fragments of the mainsail lay loosely along the boom, and a halyard was slack and swinging idly back and forth with the rocking of the boat. There was no sign of life. "Ahoy, windsong!" Neil shouted as Tony brought Vagabond so close to the wind that all 3 sails luffed and she was almost dead in the water 10 yards away from the 40-foot ketch. "Hit the horn," Neil said to Tony, who gave one loud blast from the air horn on the control panel shelf. "Are you going aboard?" Frank asked Neil. Just then a figure emerged from the cabin into the ship's cockpit, crouched and blinking in the bright sunlight. A small unshaven man in his 40s, wearing only a bathing suit, stared at them. Neil and the others stared back, stunned. "Can we assist you?" Neil asked loudly after the shocked silence. "Water!" the man said hoarsely. He was hollow-eyed. "Water!" he repeated more loudly. As Jim ducked below to get some of their precious water, and the man peered down into his own cabin, Frank came up to Neil. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Take him off," Neil answered, staring glumly at the stricken windsong. "Back her off a bit," he added to Tony, "then bring her up to the port side, get the fenders." "There must be others aboard," Jim said, returning with the water. "He can't be alone." "The guy's practically dead," Tony said, easing back up alongside Windsong. Neil and Frank moored the 2 boats side by side with the fenders cushioning their impact. "Do you want to abandon ship?" Neil asked. "We can take you aboard." The man, the bones of his rib cage protruding grotesquely beneath the skin of his emaciated body, lowered his head and stared at the water. "We're all dying," he answered. "I don't know." "Radiation sickness isn't necessarily fatal," Neil said. "You may recover." The man looked back up at Neil. "I know," he said. "That's what's hell. But my wife and daughter are almost dead. They'll never make it." Jim handed a plastic jug of water across to the man who, with sudden agility, grabbed it and hugged it to his chest. "Let me go below and decide what we'll do," he said, and made his way less nimbly down into the cabin of his boat. Neil, Frank and Tony were left in the side cockpit waiting. "What is this shit?" Macklin said, suddenly appearing beside them, looking sleepy, the hairs on his chest glistening with sweat. "You're bringing more people on board to raid our food and water?" Neil did not reply. If they're all dying, Tony said, it'll just be a waste. You said yourself that the prospects of finding food in the Bahamas don't look good. I know, Neil said. What happened to your fucking principle of triage? Macklin interjected. Neil didn't answer. The four of them stood silently in the gentle rocking vagabond, awaiting the reappearance of the dying man. What had happened to triage, thought Neil. Was at sea, you didn't abandon a fellow sailor. The man emerged from the cabin. I'd appreciate if you could take us off, he said. When they stared at him, he finally added, I'll need help. Mac, said Neil, get aboard and give the man a hand. Go yourself, Macklin said and stalked away. I'll go, said Frank. He boarded Windsong ahead of Jim, but suddenly noticed along the combing and in the corners of the cockpit a fine grey ash. He first took it to be sand, but with a stab of fear realised it was radioactive debris. He clambered quickly on board Vagabond, pushing Jim back ahead of him. Jesus Christ, he told Neil, there's fallout on deck. Neil looked and frowned. This is ridiculous, said Tony. Let's get out of here. Neil hesitated again and then turned to Frank. I'll get on board and help him off, he said. I'll help you, said Jim. You stay here, Frank said gloomily to Neil, grabbing his shoulder. If you're bum arm, you're the wrong man for the job. After Frank boarded Windsong, Jim quickly followed. Ducking below into the main cabin, Frank saw that there were two women lying under dirty sheets on opposite sides of the main saloon, or what normally would have been settees. The cabin was a jumble of pails, towels, open cans of food, dirty dishes, clothing, blankets. The stench of sweat, urine and excrement was stifling. The small hollow-eyed man stood apologetically next to his wife. They can't walk and I can't lift them, he said. Frank pushed himself over to the older woman, bent over and tried to force himself to smile. But when he saw the grey-faced, frozen apparition that was staring up at him, the "Hi," he had been about to speak froze in his throat. He grasped. Without any further efforts of sociability, he leaned over and picked her up and headed back towards the gangway. The woman was almost dead. She was wearing nothing under the sheet, and the contact of his hands with her naked flesh after seeing death on her face horrified and disgusted him. He wanted to run up the stairs, but Jim appeared on his way down. Bring the girl and get out quick, he said sharply. Teeth gritted. His face showing his fear and disgust, Frank climbed the cabin steps, went quickly over to Vagabond, and refusing Jean's offer of assistance, thrust himself from one boat to the other. Where are you putting her? Jean asked. Frank's cabin, I'm afraid, Neil interjected. All three. Frank carried the woman below. Jim had suffered the same sickening shock at the sight and smell of the Windsong's cabin, as with his face averted he gently slid his arms under the daughter and lifted her up. She was small and light. As he took her in his arms, he noticed that she turned her face away from him. Come on, he said to the man and started back to Vagabond. Are there things we can salvage from Windsong? Neil asked Frank. He was coming out of the cabin after lifting the woman up on his double berth and instructing Jim to put the girl in beside her. Macklin stood nearby, glaring. No, Frank snapped back. Let's get away now, fast. The skeleton of a man, standing slightly bent over the starboard cockpit a few feet away, grimaced. We've got a few emergency rations that you can have. It's stored. Let's go, Macklin said sharply to Neil. That ship's contaminated. Everything on it may be carrying death. Let's go. He brushed past the man and untied the aft line that kept Vagabond rafted to the other ship, and then hurried forward to get the other line. In just a few seconds Vagabond fell away, her sails filling, and then surged forward and past the stricken Windsong. The owner turned and looked at her as Vagabond steadily moved away. Then the man moved slowly to the hatchway to go below. Frank stepped trembling into the wheelhouse to stow the fenders. Macklin was handing back to him. Take it easy, Frank, Neil said. We've brought death aboard, Frank said grimly. Neil stared forward past the little transistor radio that lay on the control panel shelf. It was as tight-lipped as Frank. I know, Neil replied.